Welcome back to another episode of the Debrief, covering Season 3, Finding Heidi. I'm Jacob Saffle, and we're going to be taking a closer look into one of Gilt's biggest, if not Gilt's biggest case to date with Ryan Wolf. How are you, Ryan?
I'm very good, Jacob. How are you?
I'm good. It's a rainy day over here in the States, but nothing too crazy. So we'll be unpacking the details that stand out, and I can tell you the episodes that we get into today, there are some details that stand out without a doubt, to say the least. So I'm really excited to dive into this one. Don't forget, if you are new to the season, make sure you go back and listen to these, because we split hairs on some of these details, and it can be a little bit overwhelming as these things start snowballing and rolling out. So make sure you re-listen to those if you've heard them already. If you haven't, definitely go there first, so you can keep up with us. And don't forget, we are also on YouTube as well. So if you want that visual piece, especially in these episodes and the episodes to come, there's going to be some locations that are really specific. So in order to kind of follow us, we're going to use some maps and things like that. So check out our YouTube channel to follow along there. But without any further ado, let's get into it. So the first episode we're going to dive into today is episode 10. I have to say, it's amazing to me that as this season progresses, I can't help but notice, almost like whoever the culprit may have been with Heidi and Urban, the recklessness of them just really parading around with these people, the amount of sightings alongside whoever we're tracking here or whoever we're looking for, they just pile on, right? And not really out of the public eye. Some of these places they walked into you don't walk into these places if you're trying to hide yourself, right? So did that strike you ever, going through some of these sightings that come up, like, man, these guys really just walked around with these people?
Yeah, it's something that really stands out. And I find it, again, interesting reviewing back over these episodes, and because this is one of those seasons where there was just, I said it before, sort of an orgy of evidence, right? Like, there's just so much stuff came through, and so many people with different stories of potential sightings. And I suppose I say the word potential too, is because a lot of the time there's no way to sort of corroborate it. There's no way to confirm 100% that was what they saw. But I think a lot of them, I can walk away and feel pretty confident that people maybe did see what they saw, but it's really the thing that stands out, right? Like, that if true, some of these sightings, you're literally taking a woman who has been abducted and parading her around this area, and as if there's no problem in the world, sort of thing, which it's brazen for sure, if that's what's happened. And I think, in these episodes is where we start to see this happening. And you can either look at it two ways when you're looking at that, right? It's either incredibly brazen, hard to explain, or potentially these sightings aren't what we think they are, right? And that's why they're so brazen. So you're in the middle there, wondering which way it goes and which way it could lean. But in terms of this case, there's something about it that's different to other cases, I think, where there was a brazen in broad daylight element to the whole thing. Even when you talk about the Crosby's clearing thing, sort of historically, and whether or not that is Heidi up there or not. But again, it's that broad daylight potential, thing that we're seeing in these episodes now. But yeah, it really stands out, and I think also it lends itself to the fact that this area of Whangamata and Coromandel back then, it was the Wild West a bit. It was pretty isolated. The communities, especially at that time of year when it's not summer, that's one of those situations where in summer the population swells, right, to like 100,000 people or something, but then in those winter months there might only be 2,000 or 3,000 people living there. And so did these people think that they could just brazenly move around because, it's just bugger all people?
Right. So the first one we kind of go to, because we go through a number of sightings in this episode and the next. First of all, three kind of individuals that, again, from a listener standpoint, kind of it's not, I don't want to say blend together, but want to make sure we distinguish the three. We've got Graham Manning, Kay Manning, and Michelle. Talk to me about these three people, who they are, how they relate to one another.
Yeah, so Graham Manning. So we're talking about his sighting. He owned the Foursquare in Thames, and this was such a key part of the police case, which was and what we'll do is we'll open up. I'm going to open up the map here so we can have a look. Just give me 1 second here. Share this window. Okie dokie. So I've opened up the map that's on our war room, and this is actually good. I've been populating some more points on here today, and it's the only place where you can really see a map that starts to connect all the points from maybe the existing police case, as well as some of the points we find, and you can get an idea here when you're looking at sort of the East Coast more, where Urban's body was found, versus over where Crosby's clearing in Thames is. So we'll zoom in to this area, and this is Thames, and this Foursquare is where Graham believed that Heidi and Urban showed up, came in to buy a few things, like fruit and nuts and things like that you might take on a hike, and asked him details about a nearby hike, or tramp as we call it in New Zealand, and according to him, they'd said that they were planning on going up to Table Mountain, I believe it is, and he had sort of advised them, oh no, you shouldn't go up that way or do this way because it's too difficult, it's too wet, kind of thing, and that they were adamant that that's what they were going to do. So he was a big part of the police case, and then as the podcast sort of started coming out, his daughters got hold of me all these years later, and he's passed away today, and we hear from his daughters, and there's for the first time ever, I think, some doubt is potentially cast over his story by one of his daughters. Not that she's saying it didn't happen, just saying that she always felt a little bit icky about everything that he had said to police, because I think he maybe wanted to be involved, and in a way was involved. There was almost a bit of a conflict of interest in a way, because I think the police were actually using the Foursquare as, they had an account there and they were going in and out of there all the time dealing. So these people he would have been dealing with the police on a day-to-day basis. And she just sort of said, hey, I always just thought it felt, she was a bit worried about the reliability of what her dad might have said.
Yeah. And I thought, again, it was something that we may have suspected through, in the earlier episodes, but coming from her, someone so close to him, it definitely kind of gives us some affirmation to some of those earlier episodes where you kind of talk about, and the term grooming is so, has such a negative connotation, and for right reasons, but maybe that's not the word we're looking for, but some form of confirmation bias, I think he was probably fell victim to, or it seems that way. And hearing it from her, just like I said, affirm some of those early things that we talked about. She talks about the sighting with very interesting sighting. This is kind of the first time we get the idea, or the idea is introduced, that there are multiple individuals along with Heidi and Urban, right? She talks about the three men walked in looking like they just murdered someone, is what she said. That's a very bold way to say that. You know what I mean? So I do have questions like, okay, before the case of these missing Swedes comes out, is that how you would have described that? Or or was it just kind of they were kind of weird looking? They kind of were off putting a little bit. What was your take on that when she kind of introduced that? Was this the first time that you had heard the idea of multiple people being involved?
Yeah, it's interesting this, right? And so often when you have something like this, and it's just that wording that can hit, and when she says that, like, they look like they just killed someone. Of course, when you're dealing in this case, right, it stands out.
Right.
I think at this point in my investigation, yeah, this concept that there could have been more people coming over here connected to this, it was sort of starting to come into the frame. And on the map here, while I've got it open, so we can sort of just zoom out a little bit here, and there's 3 points here which are perfect. So we can see the Foursquare location, which is in Thames here, and then this Tararoo Creek Road, which is where this car is here. This is where, just up here is where the car was found, and is the access way to Crosby's Clearing, where that exclamation mark is. So there'd been sightings potentially that I'd heard of a car going up and down Tararoo Creek Road over that weekend, sort of repeatedly, almost described as sort of hoons kind of thing, and people describing a car similar to the Swedes. I hadn't spoken myself to people that had sort of said this, but I'd read it in old archive and so on, and hearing what she was saying, and it started to make me think, like, has someone ended up, a group of guys with this car, have they driven up Tararoo Creek Road? Like, is this connected? But again, at the same time, it was one of these things that, what do you do with it, right? Like, it's just something that's kind of interesting, could be very important, but impossible to sort of prove that it's connected. But yeah, it was certainly one of those. I know that at the time, I remember when I released this episode, that got a lot of attention. A lot of people thought, that point that she'd made was an important one, and they latched onto it.
This episode kind of harps on a point that I think I probably discussed in earlier episodes, if not the debrief for season 6. The concept of memory anchors is something I hear across a lot of true crime podcasts or investigations, where there's these pieces of information buried within these memories that are really crisp and really clear to people. The things in between them may be a little bit fuzzy, but there's those very specific things that serve as kind of anchors to your story or what you do remember. And the one that stands out here is, where she talks about Watney's cigarette brand was always the same, right? Except this time it was different. So she remembers that so specifically because there was a brand, right? And you always get that brand, and so maybe it wasn't him, and it's those kinds of things that are always really interesting to me, because it takes a lead or a tip like this, and it roots it in pretty clear reality, and allows those people to kind of go back and have those memories remain intact. We're dealing with one of those in season 6 too, where there are very specific pieces of this story that they're telling that stand out. Other things may get blurry along the way, but no, I know it was this. And matter of fact, in the last couple weeks of debriefs for season 6, we've kind of seen that. No, that particular detail he mentioned is exactly what he thought it was, right? So this is another instance of that, and I that concept always really comes into play. And in this particular episode, to me, there are a lot of instances of that. This one kind of goes into, and I believe it's a second woman that has another sighting of the Swedes. And again, we talk about, we've heard it over and over, striking people. She talks about how they're gorgeous looking people speaking a foreign language. And it really struck her. It brings me back to the audacity of parading these people around, because it's not just that you've abducted these people. You've abducted people that no one's going to miss. Do you know what I mean? So to me, that speaks to, I don't know that it speaks to to me, it almost suggests to me that there was no fear of repercussion. You know what I mean? It almost suggests to me that there is a kind of a grasp on their local position or local perception that alleviates that fear of anything happening to them, and the audacity to do that. That all kind of culminates in the third episode we're going to talk about. But as these things kind of go along, do you find yourself going, okay, what more are these guys capable of? Do you know what I mean? That's a question that comes to mind for me. Because I mean, we're getting really down to the nitty gritty. We're getting down to these sightings where it's almost sporadic at this point. It's almost like if events are unfolding, it seems like things may be getting out of hand for them, but they're still intact as confidence. Do you know what I mean? I mean, and maybe I'm just kind of chasing a rabbit there. But did you get that sense that it seems like whatever is happening at this moment in time, there's just no real consideration for what may come?
Yeah, I think 100%, right? I mean, I mean, that's the thing, right? With all these sightings, I feel like they won't all. They've, at least some of them have to be accurate, and many of them have that same.
Right.
Many of them have that same familiar feel, which is the real public nature to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's so hard, because with these sightings, like they are, in some ways they do become kind of sporadic. They sort of pop up around in different spots, but people often describe sort of the same thing. A guy fitting like a swarthy kind of complexion, sort of maybe with a mustache or something, right, with Heidi, like holding her hand or holding her arm or something like this. And it's just, it seems to generally too, it always tends to be the same thing. It's that thing, but it's just in slightly different spots. Yeah.
And then later in this episode, Rodney gives us another one where they walk in and out of a hotel. They walk in and literally walk right back out, which is suspicious in and of itself. But then on top of that, the circumstance. But so we talk about kind of the way that these sightings kind of unfold, almost corroborating each other and just kind of the nature of how they happen. Now, couple that with the idea that because of where these sightings happened, they were discounted by authorities. What are your thoughts there? How much did that truly limit this investigation?
Oh, you'd have to think massively, right? I mean, I've heard sort of anecdotally from a lot of people that they were told when they contacted police, more or less, look, we're not interested in that side because it's not relevant, right? Like we know what we're doing. We're focused on this area. Like basically, please don't contact us with anything from the east coast of the Coromandel because it's not relevant. We know what their movements were on the east coast to a certain point, and then after that, we're fine. When you look at it in hindsight, when the body's then discovered a couple of years later, and lo and behold, it's over there on the east coast. All of these leads that were coming in and these sightings, they're, like that. The lead is gone so cold now by this point, right? You imagine if they were following these up at the time, focused on that east coast. Let's just say if Urban's body was found straight away, they would have been focusing on all those east coast sightings. It's the real shame of this case that happened, because I think the ship sailed so far and so fast in this case that by the time a couple of years down the track that Urban's body's found, and there's so much of it, so many of these people were turned away, and then over time memory fades and so on and so forth. You even look at people like Barry Lindsay, right, and he doesn't end up coming out till I meet him all these years later. But I think the reality is that failure to look in those early weeks and days and months at that East Coast probably or almost definitely had the result of this case not really being solved and Heidi not being found. I don't really think there's any other way that you can look at it other than to sort of to say that. We don't know what may have happened, right? But when the noose starts tightening on people during the time and pressure goes on, if the police were honing in on the right area, who knows what that pressure might have done and what someone close to these people might have said. But I think because the investigation was clearly so far off track in terms of where they were looking, there was probably a real sense of breathing room, from people potentially involved that, we're in a complete different area.
Yeah. Re-listening to these 3 episodes in particular, re-listening allows me to kind of, that first, and I do encourage all listeners to any of the Guilt seasons, definitely, if you can, give each episode a second listen at some point, because there's so much information that you are uncovering in such a fast pace. It's almost like ironing a shirt. It's like that first pass, you kind of get the big wrinkles out, but then the next one, you can really, make it really nice and clean and catch all those details. And I love the way that these 3 episodes kind of rolled out. It's almost as if like there's this camera lens that's slowly coming into focus. This is the first time, like we mentioned, the idea of multiple people being involved. And you kind of piece that together with these sightings. And this next episode that we roll into is a little more of that, a little more of those, again, these, at least at first glance, isolated sightings, but that all kind of come into play, but it all kind of leads to things coming more into focus. This next episode, episode 11, there's an anonymous sighting. A woman, she says hitchhiking what she thought was with her husband. But it was, again, kind of those same, the same song and dance, right? That they're shoulder to shoulder. And I think you kind of helped her complete her sentence a little bit. Like it seemed like he was just kind of trying to keep her under control. She was like, yes, absolutely. But she makes a statement here that we've heard so many times in this podcast. And that's, and it's heartbreaking. And it's, I couldn't imagine her fright. And we hear that over and over and over from all of these people, is she looks like she was terrified, or and this one in particular, she it's really haunted her that, oh my God, I passed her, didn't really think much of it, but this must have been what was going on inside at the time, and this one actually has caused her not to want to go back there anymore.
This is the one at Ohui Beach.
Yes.
So I'm on the map now, and I've got a pin prepared here, which is sort of roughly in the spot of where the sighting was. So Ohui Beach is, it's still in that same area of Whangamata and Coromandel. It's only about a 7-minute drive north of Whangamata, right? And from where Urban's body's found, not that far by car. The thing with Ohui as well is that it's quite an isolated beach. You can see it's a beautiful long beach there, and it's more built up now than it was back then. But when you go out there, it's when you drive up to the beach, there's kind of sort of a hilly bit that goes over down to the beach. So it has this sense of real isolation, and it's not like you can see everywhere clearly. Mm-hmm. And I could imagine when she's running down this beach, and if she looks up and sees that, it might be quite off-putting. And I guess, it doesn't strike her till later on that's what she believed she saw, which was, Heidi with this man, that fit David Tamahidi's description, or David Turner's description, as we'll talk about further down the track, or the description of, a Maori man, maybe with a mustache or whatever, looking kind of swarthy, holding her by the arm, and, and her looking not comfortable kind of thing. It's that same story. And then you sort of, how do you piece that into the rest of the sightings and what and why would you be standing there like that? You end up with as many questions as you do answers. But it's another one of those ones, where people, it's affected their whole lives, right? This one thing. And so many people that would contact me would do so more or less saying like, look, I've felt guilty about this for so long. I need to offload this guilt a little bit to you. I now feel like if I pass this on, I've done what I can, and I can feel sort of good about that. But yeah, an interesting one. And over time, as things go on, Ohui is a place that pops up here in a game. We do hear it a few different times. So, it's always been an area that's of interest for sure.
Right. And this episode kind of pivots to a couple more instances or conversations that really end unfortunately, but the next one is going to be the cassette tapes. Talk to me about the cassette tapes, the pack with the cassette tapes. What an interesting find, first of all.
Yeah, right, like this guy contacts me, Ben, if that's his name. He contacts me and says, hey, look, man, like he does sort of kind of spelunking, like a bit of caving type thing, where he was looking for, he's a bit more of a geologist or something, and he's looking for certain types of rocks. And he said, hey, look, I'm looking for these types of rocks, and I found this old, I think he said like an old bag or something like that, but it had like tapes spilled out of it, sort of cassette tapes. And he was pretty confident that they had what appeared to be some kind of foreign language, could be Swedish or something like that. He said they were faded, like they'd clearly been there a long time. And I mean, obviously, no one's used cassette tapes really for 20 years plus, probably pushing almost, 25 years, I guess. And of course, I was super interested, and he said he was going to give me a location of it, I just said, look, can you just send me a photo? If you send me a photo, I think I'll be able to tell very quickly if this is something that is relevant and we need to look into further, sort of thing. And he said, yeah, sweet as. And then he told me roughly where the location was, very roughly, but then ghosted me basically. And the reason why that happened, I put it down to a couple things. Either A, he had gone to police, and police had said, don't tell anyone else where this is. We're going to go investigate this, sort of thing. Or perhaps, he thought that this was his story, and if it was going to be something big, that he wanted to keep it to himself. And as I sort of learned later on, this guy had sort of gone around saying that he was kind of investigating the case and stuff. So I wonder if it morphed into this idea in his head that this was his lead and he was going to do something with it. But at the time, I was just very interested in finding these tapes. And so I went to the area that he'd sort of described and spent, a whole day looking along this steep bank. And I've recently added the point into the map if you want to go check it out. Somewhere here where that bank was. I'm getting myself a little bit lost here. Yeah, there we go. It's an approximate point, but if you look in this area, you can see the road winds through this area of bush. Well, I basically searched on foot down this entire left-hand side, which was very steep down to a creek. I mean, very steep, rough bush. I found there was an old car I found that had crashed down there. It was really difficult, but I searched that whole thing trying to find these tapes, and I never found them, which was pretty frustrating. The sort of, a waste of my time when he could have just sent that photo through. But I mean, of course, I thought it could be very important, because one thing Heidi had spoken about often in her letters home, and if you've listened to the podcast, you'll know this, she loved music and she was always listening to music. And she spoke about listening to music in the car, and she would have had cassette tapes. There's no doubt, and they had to end up somewhere. I mean, they were never found, but whether she had Swedish ones or they'd bought some in New Zealand, I mean, I can't say, but it just sort of seemed like it could be possible. But unfortunately, yeah, I never heard from this guy again, and I never found anything. So sadly, that's where that sits.
You bring up an interesting point there. We heard from Mouse earlier in the season, and you were able to talk to some of the him in particular that were on this case initially. But what has your relationship been with current law enforcement on this? You mentioned the idea that, which we don't know if that's what ended up happening or whatnot, but a possibility could be that he goes to the police with it and they say, okay, don't talk to anybody about it. Have they cooperated with you at all? Have they worked with you at all throughout this investigation?
Yeah. So, this case and the case I did, Alana Cecil's case, had probably the two cases that I've had the most police involvement. Probably season 3, I'd almost say more so, but there's a lot happening in Alana's case right now. But like from very early on, I had contact with police, taking Barry Lindsay to the police. They took that very seriously, interviewed him at length. And we'll get to this further on in these debriefs, I guess, in a few weeks. But eventually, through the police, we were able to obtain a search warrant to look for the skeleton that's out at Matilda Bay. I say they obtained the search warrant, but I helped that happen. That happening was a long process, working with them, trying to get them to look at what I had, this important evidence, and take it seriously, to get the skeleton potentially found. I don't go to police willy-nilly, in terms of if I'm going to contact them with a potential new witness or a piece of evidence. It's going to have to be something for me that really meets a high bar of evidentiary value, or something I feel like we can corroborate in some way. I'm not contacting them every second week, sort of thing. So no, I've had a pretty good relationship with police right throughout this case. In terms of, it's an important thing actually to remember, and I think a lot of people sort of forget this, is, like I'm just a journalist. I don't have the powers that police have, right? Like I can't trace someone's phone records or tap someone's phone or do this and that, right? These are things that police have the ability to do. And I can't get a search warrant and go onto private property and find something. The only way for me to achieve that would be to work with the landowner and do something like that. So in order to really move a case at a certain point, you're going to need the police. If you want to take that next step with something, you need the police. So you need to have a good relationship with them. And you also need to be sure, you need to make sure that you're not crying wolf kind of thing all the time, and that they're going to take you seriously. And but yeah, no, I've always had a good relationship with them. I think that's what I would say. Whether they agree, I'm not sure. But I deal with some good detectives on this case. That have taken a lot of what I've given them seriously to a degree. But
I've definitely found that there's kind of two camps that depending on what local authorities, what their perspective is in any given case. I'm definitely, being a true crime listener, you kind of see them in two camps that are kind of extremes. One is they almost see you as an extension of their resources and really lean into that. And they go, all right, awesome. Hey, you can actually push this envelope a little further than we are able to. Because while, absolutely, there are things that they can do that you can't, they would say the same about you, So sometimes they'll lean into that. And then the other side of that is sometimes they almost see you as a nuisance and discourage people from cooperating with you. It really doesn't seem like there's ever an in-between. It can make all the difference in an investigation like this. you know?
I think, yeah, that's super true as well. And I've had detectives tell me many times before, that people are more likely, they believe, to tell me information than they are to tell the police, and as anyone that's dealt with police, you don't have this casual relationship like you might have speaking with a journalist, right? Like, if you go to the police with something, well, they're going to want to bring you in and take a statement, and and you might feel like the microscope's on you, and it's a daunting experience for a lot of people, where speaking to someone like myself is kind of that middle ground, so yeah, I think there's times when police, and not just in my case but around the world, and yeah, they probably just sort of like look back and see what's happening and what other people are saying, and see if it lines up with maybe what they've been told by the same people. So I imagine if I was a detective, that's what I'd be doing anyway, to sort of why not.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that kind of brings us into the third conversation you have in this episode, and which is with Darren Lindsay, which is a really important piece of information, if not, if anything, for the implications it has on the timeline of this case. So talk us through this particular sighting. I know you got Darren on the phone one time, but I don't think you were able to circle back with him after that. But talk us through that and how the implications of him actually performing the action that that there were questions about, how that actually impacts how things lay out.
Yeah. So Darren Lindsay's an interesting element of this case. And yeah, like you said, this was the one time I spoke to Darren on the phone. We did send some messages, but he sort of made it clear in a certain number of words that he wasn't going to speak again on the phone. But, and just to show the connection here, that Darren Lindsay is Barry Lindsay's son. So Barry Lindsay had, so I'm going to zoom in on the map here. So Barry Lindsay had a property that sort of ran up here. Darren was his son. And Darren was, during this time, was more or less sort of living in the Parakawai bush, which sounds kind of crazy, but it's true. He was only young, like sort of 14, 15, and him and his father weren't getting along well at the time, to the degree where, yeah, Darren would spend most of his time on the Taiketo property next door, and actually built himself a cabin, sort of shack in the trees, in the bush, which is, I've actually been there and found it. There's no one lives there now, but it's quite spooky when you go there. But yeah, so Darren, when the body is found, he sort of comes out of the woodwork a bit and says, hey, well, I saw the white Subaru car parked there. I was walking up there, saw the car parked there, told me that he saw like a camera on the back seat, said there was no one around, and I think the question that everyone had with Darren was, did he see more? Is he hiding? Is he lying about more, about stealing items out of the car and so on? But yeah, his sighting, if true, creates questions around the timeline that I guess what it does is it starts to, if you believe his sighting, which I do, I don't believe he's lying. It makes sense. He was living in that bush. So if you believe he did see the car there and it was sitting there, and the timeline of the day that he sort of thought that he saw it there, you start to realize, okay, there must be a timeline here that doesn't actually fit in with what's known or believed about the case. And that timeline could be sort of the key to everything. And it's honestly one of those things that can it can do your head in, trying to come up with theories of how the timeline can work. But Darren's story is very interesting. I think it's one of the key pieces of the puzzle. But it's just how does it fit exactly? And I've always sort of felt, does he know more? I'm not too sure.
Well, and it's a tough conversation to have because, we're not concerned of whether or not with the morality of you taking anything out of that car, right?
Yeah.
But I'll be honest, in the conversation that you did have with him, it doesn't seem like he's able to shake that thought. Like I don't know that he's ever, even if he did, I don't know that he's ever going to let that go, because there's just kind of a moral perception to that. And as much as you can say, hey, I don't care, that's not the point. I don't know that we're ever going to kind of break through that wall. But that kind of takes us into this really, to me, is the true turning point of this season, the bombshell episode, episode 12. And this is the story that Darren Old brings you. So first of all, countless curveballs that this episode throws us. I have to admit, and again, another one of those re-listening. Oh my God, it's not just this, it's that. But so I think the first way to kind of address this episode is, first off, this isn't the first time we've heard from Darren Old. So as a listener, he's, to kind of clarify, he was one of the people that finds Urban's body.
Correct.
Which you travel with him in an earlier episode in this season to go to that site, and we hear from him. At that time, had you already had this conversation?
I had not had this conversation really. I think early on he may have sort of hinted that there was something kind of more without saying too much. But yeah, let me be clear, and it's important actually. So in the episode that you hear, episode 12, which is titled My Fucking Hero, that is not the first time he has told me. And I think it can sound like perhaps I'm leading him there, because we have had this conversation before, but it was not recorded. And so basically I'd said to Darren, and we'd spoken about this at length, do you want to go public with this story? And he believed that it was the right thing to do. And I was like, if you're sure. But then of course we had to sit down and record this this interview, sort of as if kind of in a way it was the first time I'd heard it. So I'd heard the story before, but there's something different about a story when you're hearing it, when the person knows, okay, the mic's on, they're being recorded, this is for the official thing. It can raise the tension of the situation somewhat. But honestly, it was, there's no doubt at all that I knew that this was a seriously pivotal part of this whole thing, of this whole case. And with Darren, I think the thing that always stuck out to me, right? He's not just a random guy, okay? If he had come off the street and he'd never been in this case before, no one had ever heard of him, and he tells this story, I saw Heidi being dragged by this guy, David Turner. I mean, would it carry the same weight as him being the person who actually found the body? I think that fact added so much weight to his story, that this guy was someone who was already connected with this case, and that area. Yeah, and I mean, I think at this point, this is when the whole story completely exploded.
Right. Yeah. I get, I talk about the curveballs. So I think it's best to just kind of go, let's go through the list of them. First of all, his account kind of in a nutshell is that he goes to the Turners because that's where that's his plug, so to speak. That's where he goes to get his weed. Right. And he walks in and he sees Heidi and Urban there. In this situation where it clearly looks like they're there not of their own will. It's super sketchy. And again, these are people that you don't forget. These are people you don't see every day in this area. First of all, this is the introduction of the Turners. Fill that in for me a little bit. What had you heard that name before outside of Darren Old, or is this the first time you'd really heard of the Turners?
No, so this is when Darren tells me this about David Turner, this is the first I'd heard of it. And frankly, I think because it was so out of left field, there's part of you that you're sort of shaking your head a little bit, kind of like, that's how, like what, how does that make sense? But then as what I found is as things went on and more people started to come out in further episodes, in reality, it all happened around this time, a lot of stuff happening all at once, which then sort of came out in further episodes. But I realized pretty quickly that this wasn't bullshit, that this was true. We were at this point in the podcast introduced to this family, the Turner family, and the fact that, and actually while we're here, let's just quickly, because we've got the map open here, the geography of this part is really, really, really important. Right. So if you look on the map now, you can see here, this is where Urban's body's found. We can see 2 pins, and I've actually added, that's the approximate location of Urban's body. And then this is where Darren Lindsay tells police he saw the white Subaru parked. Now it's hard to see in here, but there's a forest road that runs down through these trees. Now it's very distinct when you're there, but just the trees have sort of covered it over in the aerial photos. But it runs down here to this point, which is there's a small ford which crosses over the Ohui River, which is just it's a very small little river there. Now this runs back here to some key important areas. Now there's one here area which is called the Batch. This is what will come up later on, but Darren talking about this Batch, which was down the bottom, and this is where David Turner and some of these other people used to hang out, Darren Lindsay and so on. And Darren Lindsay's cabin is actually sort of hidden in the bush just up here somewhere. So if we just zoom back out, we can bring these points all in. So this is the spot where Darren says that he saw Heidi being led by the arm by David Turner, and then of course he says he saw Urban in the cabin as well. Now this property that runs sort of all the way up, almost in a straight line up to here until it becomes the forestry block. But that property was the Taiketo property, but it was actually being managed by the Turners, by David Turner, James Turner's father. So you can see all of these points here, which become important points as we go through the podcast, and they're all connected quite close by. And there's one thing that's the key point of all of it is, this is where Urban's body's found as well, right? So we're talking about the same area. You could go over to Thames on the other side to Crosby's Clearing, and you can say whatever you want, but there's no body there. If a body was found in Crosby's Clearing, then you might, of course, all of those points become much more important, but there wasn't. There never was. But over here, we've got a body, and now we've got all these important points and these potential sightings. And I should add that Barry Lindsay's sighting, actually, this might be right here. Here we go. Barry Lindsay says he saw, the car driving up. He claimed it was David Tamahedi driving it up that same road. So suddenly you've got the car driving up this road in the direction the body was eventually found. And then Darren's sighting further up here. It wasn't just as a quick digression. It's interesting to note, though, if you're thinking about timeline, that when Barry Lindsay claims that he saw Heidi and Urban in the car, they were relaxed. Like it didn't look like there were any issues at that point. But yeah, that's the Turners were running that property that we can see on the map. We can see those points there. It was an explosive new element to the case that there was this new family, because not only did Darren speak about David Turner, but he also spoke about his brothers, Donald Turner Jr. and James Turner as well, who he was more or less implicating in the murders of Heidi and Urban as well.
Yeah, I talked about curveballs. Let's talk about these. Well, we're trying to piece together this timeline of the white Subaru station wagon. Enter this story. He rolls up. They're switching license plates. There are 2, right? Okay, that's a curveball that no one could have seen coming, and kind of takes the idea of a timeline and goes, okay, well, how do we piece this together now? You know, because which one is it? Do you know what I mean? So it really, it truly just kind of, you know, takes what we feel like we had a good handle on, and to me, it just kind of shakes it up. You know, I assume they hit you the same way. Like, okay, well, what are your thoughts on the implications of where we're trying to place that station wagon?
Yeah, I mean, the car and Darren Old's story about what he says he saw, and the car and the potential second car became, gosh, it was the unicorn of this case that I chased around and round in circles for a while. In some ways, it felt like this made sense, okay, but in other ways, it seemed like complete madness. You know, really, you know, is this really likely? But you know, as well, with some of these witnesses, right? I mean, you can't cherry pick what you want to take. So if Darren's saying, you know, I saw this, you know, and then I also saw this and this, it's sort of disingenuous to pick that bit and say, no, I don't believe any of that, you know? So it was a hard one because Darren wasn't able to add much more other than what he saw, but he seemed very confident in what he believed, that the second car had been buried and so on. I think we go into it further on as we get into the podcast, but this description about changing these license plates, that whole part of it too was just was mind blowing. To be honest, it really was. And I think as listeners too, yeah, I think the feedback was the same kind of thing.
Yeah. You know, it's one of those things where I feel like it's over and over in this case, it almost could be scripted. Do you know what I mean? It's like that murder mystery where the reveal comes out, well, actually I had a twin, right? You know, or something crazy like that, where it's like,
yeah,
what?
Yeah.
Like, and how do you
like
know,
Prestige? Yeah,
exactly. It's like, if it's written in a movie, it's either gonna, you know, be, oh my God, an amazing twist, or it fell flat because it was so ridiculous. You know, it's almost, which on that note, can we talk about the resemblance between these two guys, David Turner, David Tamahiri?
yeah, and this was an important element of Darren's thing, right? Is that he was sort of saying, David Tamahiri didn't do this, it was David Turner. Ryan, they look the same. They look the same. Anyone that thinks that they saw him, David Tamahiri, look, they could have easily thought that it was David Turner. They were both similar sort of size, sort of stockiness, similar sort of complexion, you know, like darker skin, but not really dark. Both had like a mustache, similar kind of description of their eyes, you know, they're sort of dark, piercing kind of eyes. And that was Darren's sort of big thing, was that people have just been mistaken. They've mistaken David Tamahiri for David Turner. It always felt like that the way Darren spoke about things in this, when he sort of started to lay this stuff out to me, you know, he spoke about it a lot of the time, not like a person who was guessing. It was like he was telling me what the situation was, which always I found interesting. You know, at the beginning, you know, I remember him speaking about Crosby's Clearing, and he's like, that wasn't Heidi and Urban up there, and you know, he's basically said, you know, that was David Turner and someone else that was there. You know, and it was, but God, I just trying to think back to that time, man, and how crazy it was. But you certainly felt like you couldn't ignore anything that Darren was saying. It did feel like a film. Some of it felt too good to be true, and some of it seemed to make perfect sense as well. But yeah, a big part of his thing was saying that David Turner and David Tamahiri looked very similar.
And you mentioned it earlier, but you do have to remember that this is, like you said, Darren Old is not just some random guy. This isn't a sighting. These are people he knew, people he spent time with, and people he knew very well, and people that he was also aware it could risk his own safety should he even bring this forward. We talk about, he mentions David Turner showing up at his sister's, the trip that he takes out with him in the bush where he's going to go steal some weed, and he's like, well, there's not any up there, I don't understand. And man, it hit me like a hammer when you said it, when you asked him that in the episode, but you said, do you think he had planned to kill you that day? Wow. This is heavy stuff we're dealing with here. So I think, again, it just speaks to, what you're talking about. This isn't speculation. This guy knew the risk he was taking coming to you with this, Yeah.
I certainly, and that wasn't lost on me, prior to us releasing that episode, I didn't, this wasn't a situation where I said like, sweet, let's do it without thinking about it. I was like, are you sure you want to do this? And, Darren, to his credit, basically his angle was, well, if I'm going to be, because what I said is like, hey, look, man, we could release this sort of anonymously or something like this so people wouldn't know it was you. And to his credit, he was like, well, if I'm going to be outing David Turner, saying his name and putting him in the spotlight, he's like, I think that I should have to put my name out there too. It's not fair of me to put him under the bus if I'm not going to put myself out there, which I respected that, and at the same time, I'm putting myself out there too, putting this guy's name out there, and someone who Darren made pretty clear. And by this point too, I was starting to be made aware from others that was a dangerous guy. And, as we'll find out more later on. But yeah, like, just thinking back about that story, right? I mean, that story is something that sort of just gets lost in the bigger picture of this podcast. In this case, just that one little story Darren tells about, Turner taking him for a drive up a bit further north in Coromandel. Yeah, like I think what he said, they were going to rip some weed off, and then they get there and, and there's no weed, and Darren just sensed that something didn't feel right that day. And yeah, I mean, it is heavy, right? To think that, sit there and say, yeah, I think that he was planning on killing me, or maybe he was still making the decision whether he was going to and then didn't. And then you would have to ask the question, though, if that were true, well, like, why? Why? And I would have to say that it would not be, just my opinion, a person shows up and maybe, sees you pulling this girl at this property when you come up to buy weed, and that's all it is that a reason that you would potentially kill a person? I don't know. You threaten, maybe kill, I don't know, but unless there's something more, unless David thought that Darren knew more. But yeah, it's pretty wild stuff. And yeah, but I had to commend Darren at the time that we did this, like he had a lot of courage.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a great spot to end this debrief, because we're about to dive right into that, and the way that you released the following episodes 13, 14, and 15, that was a package deal to subscribers at the time because of how these things all fit together. So I'm really excited for next week, so we can kind of dive into that, because man, it's my concern is, how do we fit that in an hour? You know what I mean? There's so much. But yeah, I'm really excited for that. And I have to reiterate, this isn't a movie. This is real stuff that you've uncovered here. And this is why you do what you do on Guilt. This is why the Brevity team does what they do, is for things like this. So yeah, if I haven't done enough, I commend you on your work here, commend you on the way you handled these episodes in particular, and I'm excited to kind of dive into the rest. But yeah, next week we'll be working through, like I said, episodes 13, 14, and 15. So you guys definitely check those out. Listen to those. Take your notes, man, because I'm going to be taking mine. There's plenty of things to pick up on in there. And as always, if you have questions, go to theguiltpodcast.com and send those to us. We'd love to hear from you. You guys are a great resource in these investigations. You bring up things that us at the Brevity team don't always catch, and you're a very, very valuable and integral part to this. So let us know using those forms on the website. And as always, keep up to date on the current season as well. Season 6, we're kind of on the home stretch there on a really important case. So don't forget our YouTube channel as well. You'll have a debrief coming on season 6 very soon as well. So from all of us at the Guilt team, we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.